Imagine being 16 years old, dying of leprosy so advanced you cannot feel the reins of your horse because your hands are decomposing, nerve ending by nerve ending, staring at a horizon where 26,000 soldiers, led by the greatest conqueror of the age, are marching to burn your city to the ground. November 1177, you're Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, and you have 500 knights against odds of 50 to 1. By every law of war, by every calculation of logic, you're already dead. Your body is rotting while you still breathe. Your advisors are telling you to flee. But you don't flee. You tighten your grip on a sword you can barely feel and order the charge. This is the Battle of Montgisard, the single most impossible military victory of the Middle Ages, where a dying boy broke the spine of an empire through sheer will and perfect timing. Think about the mathematical and medical impossibility. 500 knights defeating 26,000 professional soldiers while their commander's hands are so numb from leprosy, he has to have the reins tied around his wrists. Baldwin IV was not just a king, he was a walking corpse. Leprosy in the 12th century was a curse from God, a sentence of living death that meant being cast out of society. But Baldwin was the king of Jerusalem, so he had to rot on the throne. From age 9, when his tutor noticed he felt no pain when friends dug fingernails into his arm, Baldwin knew his time was finite. The disease attacks nerves, leaving victims numb to injury, which leads to infection, disfigurement, blindness. By 16, Baldwin was slowly disintegrating inside his royal armor, yet this decaying boy was the only thing standing between the Christian world and total annihilation. The year 1177 was a time of terrifying transition in the Holy Land. The First Crusade was distant memory. The Crusader states, those 4 fragile Christian kingdoms along the Levant coast, were surrounded. For decades, Muslim powers had been divided, squabbling among themselves, allowing Crusaders to survive. But that era was over. A new power had risen, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. Saladin was everything Baldwin was not. He was healthy, vibrant, a seasoned politician, and brilliant general in the prime of life at 40 years old. He commanded resources of a vast empire stretching from the Nile to the Tigris. He had money, manpower, and a holy mission: reclaim Jerusalem. In the eyes of the world, the matchup between Saladin and Baldwin was a joke, a lion against a lamb, a force of nature against a dying child. In autumn 1177, Saladin received intelligence that the kingdom of Jerusalem was vulnerable. The bulk of the Crusader army was distracted in the north, fighting a pointless campaign in Syria. Jerusalem was effectively open. Seeing the opportunity of a lifetime, Saladin mobilized. He didn't just send a raiding party, he brought the full weight of his Egyptian army, 26,000 men. This included his elite Mamluk bodyguards, thousands of light cavalry, Sudanese infantry, and a massive baggage train. It was an invasion force designed not just to defeat an army, but to erase a kingdom. As this tidal wave of steel and horses crossed the border into Crusader territory, panic swept through the land. Smoke from burning villages began to rise. Refugees flooded the roads, clutching children and possessions, screaming that the end of the world had arrived. There was no one to stop the invasion. The garrisons were empty. The forts were understaffed. When news reached Baldwin, he faced a choice that would define his legacy. His advisors, men with decades of experience, looked at the numbers, looked at the king's bandaged hands, told him to retreat. They told him to hole up in the fortified city of Ascalon and wait for a miracle or inevitable siege. To ride out against Saladin with only the royal household guard and a handful of knights was suicide. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. But Baldwin IV possessed something Saladin's spies could not count, and his own advisors could not understand. He had the fearlessness of the damned. When you've already lost your future, when you've already lost sensation in your own skin, you lose the fear of death. Baldwin realized that if he hid behind Ascalon's walls, Saladin would bypass him and march straight to Jerusalem. The holy city would fall while its king cowered in a fortress. That was unacceptable. So the leper king ordered his horse to be saddled. He couldn't grip the reins, so he had his grooms tie them around his wrists. He summoned every man who could hold a sword. He stripped the garrisons of the Knights Templar. He called upon the secular knights of the realm. In total, he scraped together barely 500 knights. Even counting the infantry and sergeants that followed, the numbers were laughable. They were riding out to meet a force 50 times their size. As they marched out of Ascalon's gates, the sun was beating down on the desert scrub. The heat inside chainmail would have been suffocating. Baldwin, wrapped in robes and armor to hide his disfigurement, rode at the front. Imagine the sight for soldiers behind him. They weren't following a demigod like Alexander or a giant like Charlemagne. They were following a sick teenager who might fall off his horse if he fainted from exhaustion. Yet there was a fire in him that terrified them more than the enemy. Saladin, meanwhile, was making a mistake, born of arrogance. He knew Baldwin was at Ascalon. He knew the king had a tiny force, so Saladin did what any confident conqueror would do. He ignored him. He left a small detachment to blockade Ascalon just to keep the cripple inside, and then turned his massive army north towards Jerusalem. He let his men disperse. They spread out across the countryside, pillaging, burning, looting. They were relaxed. They were confident. They thought the war was already won. They thought God had already given them the city. They were wrong. Baldwin broke out of Ascalon. He evaded the blockade and then did the unthinkable. Instead of running away, he chased the giant. He led his 500 knights up the coast, riding hard, pushing horses to the breaking point, chasing the dust cloud of Saladin's army. They were riding into the mouth of the beast towards a place called Montgisard. To understand why these men didn't simply turn around and flee, you have to understand what was riding with them. They were carrying the true cross. Riding alongside the king was the bishop of Bethlehem, and in his hands was the actual timber upon which Jesus Christ had died. To a knight in the 12th century, this wasn't just wood, this was God marching in the vanguard. If they died protecting the cross, their salvation was guaranteed. This relic acted as a psychological adrenaline shot, suppressing the natural instinct of fear. But while the army had the true cross to lift their spirits, Baldwin had only his disintegrating body to carry him. Riding a war horse is incredibly physical. It requires core strength, balance, constant manipulation of reins. For a healthy man, a forced march under the desert sun is exhausting. For Baldwin, it was torture. By this stage of his disease, leprosy had likely deadened the nerves in his hands and feet. That numbness is a double-edged sword. You cannot feel the reins digging into your palms, so you don't know if you're gripping them tight enough until they slip. You cannot feel the stirrups, so your balance is compromised. To compensate, Baldwin had to use his entire body, locking his thighs against the saddle until his muscles screamed. Beneath heavy layers of silk and chainmail, the heat would have been unbearable, turning his bandages into a stifling, sweaty prison. The friction of armor against his lesions would have caused bleeding that he couldn't even feel. He was literally bleeding into his boots, riding through a haze of heat stroke and exhaustion, fueled only by willpower that terrified his own doctors. Supporting this fragile king was a backbone of steel, the Knights Templar. Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master of the Templars, was the fist to Baldwin's spirit. The Templars were warrior monks who had sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were forbidden to retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. Here they were outnumbered 50-1, yet Odo did not flinch. Together, this strange coalition, the dying boy, the fanatic monk, and the holy relic, moved north with terrifying speed. Saladin's scouts had lost track of them. The Sultan, still confident in his slow march towards Jerusalem, had no idea that the cripple he left behind was now closing the distance at a gallop. The geography of the Holy Land funneled them together. Saladin was moving his massive army across the Wadi, a dry riverbed near the hill of Montgisard. It was a choke point. The Ayyubid army was struggling with its own weight. The baggage train was slow. Herds of stolen cattle were blocking the roads. The soldiers were tired from days of raiding. They were essentially a traffic jam armed with swords. As Baldwin's force approached Montgisard, the sun was beginning to cast long shadows. The element of surprise was absolute. Suddenly, the scouts returned to Baldwin breathless. The enemy was just ahead. Not a patrol, not a rear guard, but the entire host. They were disorganized, crossing the stream, their armor packed away in wagons due to the heat, their horses unmounted. Baldwin stopped his horse. He looked at his 500 knights. They were caked in dust, their horses foaming with sweat.